Hi everyone, welcome to this seminar on judging. My name is Bella. I'm one of the CAs of Easters this year, and so this is basically a seminar that is aimed at helping anyone who is going to start judging at Easters or doesn't have a huge amount of experience judging before. Obviously, this is in the 3v3 Australian Easters format. Okay, if it's going to let me. There we go. Cool. All right. So starting with the very basics of judging. So this is specifically if you haven't judged uni tournaments before. So there are 3 different roles you can have as a judge at a tournament. The first is the chair. The second is a panel or a wing. And the third is a trainee. If you're the chair, you'll have a little C next to your name in a circle, like the copyright sign. If you're a trainee, you'll have a T. If you're a panel, then you won't have anything. And there's a few differences between those roles. So the chair is kind of the person who leads the adjudication. They're the one who'll give the oral adjudication. So that's where you get taken through the debate and the result, after the debate for about 10 minutes. They are the one that submits the ballot, and they're the one that's expected to run the discussion. So ask the questions to the panels, facilitate all of that. The panel has voting rights. So when you're discussing the result, they have an input in the result, and we'll go on a little bit later, but they can, if there are more than one of them, then they can actually split against the chair if the panelists are in the majority, and they can be the one that ends up making the call. So yeah, they have voting rights. They can participate in writing the ballot. They participate in the discussion. Trainees, on the other hand, don't have voting rights. So even if the trainee disagrees with the decision of the panelists and the chair, they can't be someone that splits, that has any role. However, they still participate in the discussion, obviously. So for Easters, the in-rounds of Easters are consensus. What that means is that the discussion, the purpose of it is to try and come to a decision about whether the affirmative or the negative wins. And basically how that works is you have a discussion, and then let's say at the end of that discussion, you come to a call and the call is negative. The chair submits the ballot in the favor of negative. However, if at the end of the discussion, you can't come to a consensus decision, if it's one chair, one panel, then the decision is the chair's decision. If it's one chair and 2 panelists, and 2 out of the 3 people, one chair and one panel are in agreement, then it's obviously that call. However, if it's a split and there's 2 panelists and 1 chair, and the panelists disagree with the chair, they can roll the chair. And what that means is that the result of the debate is the one that the 2 panelists have come to, and one of the panelists actually gives the OA in that particular case. In the out rounds, it's different. You submit your ballot before the discussion. So each judge submits their own, and it's just a voting system. So the panels will always be odd numbers. So it'll be like a 3-2, for example, or a 4-1 split or whatever. So yeah, there can't be a tie, obviously. In terms of rules versus guidance, part of this seminar is rules, so things that you have to follow, like not speeding. Part of it is guidance, like don't drive when you're tired. Although I feel like there is a law against that now. Let's just say you don't drive after X number of sleep. So part of it is guidance, part of it is rules. And there'll be a bit of nuance in there, and I'll hopefully distinguish when I'm talking about what. So starting with rules. So the first thing to note is that in debating, there's no automatic losses. And the analogy I've got here is that, for example, if you're in a football game and you pick up the ball with your hands and throw it in the goalpost, obviously it's like, that's a really bad idea to do, but it doesn't mean you automatically lose the game. So, you can do that. It doesn't help you at all, but it doesn't mean that you get an automatic loss. So this is in the same way that, for example, if you're being continuously clapped off and you keep on speaking up until 15 minutes, your team doesn't automatically lose. It'll certainly piss off the judge, but it's not going to make you automatically lose the debate. It just doesn't help you at all. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of the same vibe. So in terms of fulfilling your role as a judge, I think there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to teams winning and teams losing. So for example, in high school debating, you could be like, well, the team didn't do a definition at first speaker, therefore they can't win the debate. And it's like, well, you don't always need to do a definition. You don't always need to do a model, all of that. Like, it's kind of just whatever works. And even if you think they should have done one and they didn't, that doesn't mean, again, that they lose the debate. And it doesn't mean that you need to penalize that speaker for not doing that, because you obviously have to adapt to the moment. Obviously, for example, if first affirmative doesn't give a definition, it maybe makes it easier for first negative because they can redefine the debate in the way that works for them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the first speaker of the affirmative team should be penalized for doing that. Similarly, in terms of new material at third, so this is a rule as opposed to a piece of guidance, which is that you cannot at third speaker provide new material. So you can't provide new constructive, but it's not an automatic loss. So the rule is no new substantive, but even if they do that, you just discount the substantive, but you don't actually impact, like you can't penalize them for doing the wrong thing because that's just, they've made a mistake. So it's just a waste of time. Like they'll kind of penalize themselves by spending time on new material that you can't count, but it's not an automatic loss. Obviously, though, third speakers can provide new rebuttal, new framing, and new weighing. Because if they can't do that, then why are they even getting up in the first place and giving a speech? Like, obviously, they can still do new stuff, but that new stuff can't be constructive. The way that you can kind of test how good, for example, third negatives rebuttal is use a robustness test. So what this means is how strong is the case that affirmative is already given against that material from third negative. So, you know, if you think that third AF's case kind of already implicitly responds to that rebuttal, then it's obviously weaker. But if you don't think it does, then that's quite strong. So that's kind of how you work out for the, well, third negative can't be responded to type of rule. Okay, so at Easters, you'll encounter a few different sorts of motions. The first sort of motion is the one that is the most popular in high school particularly, and that's a policy motion, which is that we should do X. For example, that we should ban school uniforms. The most important thing to note about these type of motions is that both teams have something that we call fiat. What fiat is basically it gives the team a certain amount of capital, like resources, that they're able to use to implement this policy. So for example, AF has fiat to say that they would ban school uniforms at public schools specifically. That's a totally fair interpretation of the topic. And they would, you know, probably have fiat. They do have fiat to assume that it would be possible to do that. So it's possible for the government to do it. So negative can't make arguments. It's like, it's not feasible to do it or whatever, because affirmative has fiat to assume that it will be done. Negative also has the same fiat, but for a different policy. So for example, they could say the capital that you would spend banning school uniforms across the country in public schools. Instead, we're going to use that capital to give subsidies to parents who can't afford school uniforms, because that would probably take a similar amount of money. So negative couldn't do a model that's absolutely ludicrous, like, no, instead we're going to give school uniforms that are all Louis Vuitton. Like, that's obviously a lot more expensive. So if it's around the same amount of capital, both teams have fiat to assume that they are able to do it. They do have the resources to undertake it. So next sort of motion is that X should do Y. So for example, that the police should opt out of Mardi Gras. So this is similar to the last motion mentioned, but it doesn't matter in this topic what the incentives of the police are. It just matters, would this be net good or net bad? So you can't make arguments that are like, the police themselves don't have an incentive to do this, because this debate isn't about whether as the police we would do it. It's about whether the police should do it in general. So that's how we would distinguish that from a second kind of motion, which is below, which is an actor motion. So one is just, is it in the general interest of like the population for something to happen, versus is it in the interest of a specific actor, so the police. So the second one is that as the police, we would opt out of Mardi Gras. So in the second one, you would make arguments like it's not in the police's interests and the police have an incentive to march in Mardi Gras. But in the first, you couldn't make those arguments because you're not arguing from their perspective. Similarly, in the first debate, you could make arguments about how LGBT people would like this, but in the second one, you couldn't, unless you could explain why that's important to the police specifically. We also have motions that are regret motions. And essentially what this debate asks you to do is consider, would the world be better or worse if this thing had happened? So for example, that we regret the creation of Marvel Studios. So the debate is on affirmative that we think that the world in 2024 would be a better place if Marvel had not been created X number of years ago. And the negative team is saying, no, it's actually better that Marvel does exist. So what's important to think about, particularly on the affirmative, is what is the counterfactual? And that's essentially thinking about, okay, you know, what would have happened if Marvel Studios hadn't been created? So would Disney be bigger? Would Sony be bigger? The reason I'm telling you all of this as an adjudicator specifically is an important thing to think about in the debate, like when you're judging the debate, is has the counterfactual been proven to be the likely option, and has it been proven that counterfactual would be good or bad? So making sure that you hold teams to a relative burden of proof when they're giving their counterfactual. However, they don't have fiat, so they need to prove why that counterfactual is likely. So for example, if affirmative says, if Marvel hadn't been created, superhero movies would never have existed, they need to prove why is it likely that superhero movies wouldn't exist. So why is it that Marvel has a monopoly such that no other market entrant would have been created or whatever? That needs to be proven, and that's something that you should take into consideration as a judge. So if affirmative just asserts a counterfactual and negative actually proves a counterfactual, then you likely opt for negative's counterfactual. Okay, so sometimes when you're judging debates, you'll get into the weeds a bit of a definitional challenge. And what this means is that the teams don't agree on what the debate should be about, for example. So this is a good rule of thumb of when should negative challenge the definition provided by affirmative. So I think there are two good instances. The first is if they set the debate unfairly or restrict it too much. And the second is if they squirrel the debate. So for example, if the debate was, we would legalize cannabis, and affirmative is like, we would legalize cannabis, but only in New South Wales, it's valid for negative to challenge that, because this debate is about like that we would legalize cannabis everywhere. Obviously, that debate would never be set because it's very impractical to legalize cannabis all around the world, but affirmative restricting it to New South Wales is unfair. They need to take a higher burden. Similarly, if they squirrel the debate, negative can challenge it. So for example, if AF says, we would ban school uniforms, but only in same-sex girls' schools, negative would say, well, no, that debate is about banning school uniforms everywhere, or as we mentioned earlier, in public schools is a fine version of that, but that is too specific, and so negative can reasonably question it. However, when is it not valid? So for example, affirmative might define the motion totally fairly, but exclude some cases. And sometimes those exclusions are fair. So for example, if the debate was, we would make voting compulsory, it's fair for affirmative to say, well, this debate only happens in places where voting already exists, so where there is some form of democracy. Otherwise, they have to prove making voting compulsory and instituting voting in countries, and that's two burdens they have to prove. So obviously that's fair. Similarly, so that means the negative cannot challenge that definition because it's been fairly established and it's reasonable. The second instance in which negative cannot challenge affirmative is if they've been a bit vague. So maybe the debate is we should ban school uniforms and affirmative doesn't give a definition. What you should assume as negative is that the definition is what the average reasonable person would think about that debate. So, okay, we should ban school uniforms in Australia and public schools is a reasonable interpretation as the general public. So that's what negative takes. What they don't do, so what you can't do as negative, is substitute in your own definition that's convenient for you. That's not something that you're able to do. You don't have the power to do that. So kind of just use your intuition. If you think that the definitional clash is reasonable, then that's fine. A lot of the time, though, it's unreasonable. Well, not a lot of the time, but some of the time it's unreasonable and means the debate is really messy. Yeah. Okay. The next thing to think about when you're a judge is the ordinary intelligent voter. So some teams might call this the OIV, others would call it the ARV, so the average reasonable voter. Those terms can be used interchangeably. And essentially what the ordinary, I realize now that one of these things they would know has now changed because Nikki Haley has dropped out of the presidential race. So I will come to that in a second. These slides were made a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So the OIV is essentially an actor that you as the judge should take the position of. So there's someone who would be like reasonably average level informed, the level you'd get from reading like the headlines in the paper, for example. And they know like layman's terms of like layman's version of economic terms. So for example, if someone says it's good to work efficiently, they would know what that means because people can kind of intuit what working efficiently means. This means that you absolutely can use your own specific knowledge, your own facts, your own information, but you need to explain how they're relevant and why they matter. So you can't just kind of assume, for example, if you had a debate that was about Russia-Ukraine, you can't assume that the judge knows the intricacies of how like long-range missiles work, for example. You need to explain why they're relevant, or even like the kind of moral quandary around military drones. You need to explain that. So those things need to be explained. You can't just assume that the judge will know everything. But similarly, as a judge, you can't put in your own personal biases into the debate. So for example, if the debate is about instituting a carbon tax, and you work for the government and you know that a carbon tax is a really bad idea, you can't discount ideas from from affirmative just because you think it's a bad idea. So you can't bring in your own personal information. So for example, if affirmative says, a carbon tax is a good idea because most people are supportive of it, obviously that's not true, but most people are supportive of it, and they then prove that, you can't be like, well, I know that's factually untrue, so I can't credit that. You need to take the average reasonable voter's perspective on that issue. So an example of the thing that the OIV would know is that Taylor Swift is currently touring, that the tour has been super successful. They would also know that, sorry, this is wrong, but they would know that Nikki Haley has dropped out of the primaries. They would be aware that she's dropped out and now Trump is the last man standing as the Republican candidate. The things they wouldn't know is the number of tickets that Taylor Swift has sold on the Eras Tour and how many cities she's playing in. Similarly, they wouldn't know the names of every candidate that has dropped out of the primary so far. So they would know that Nikki Haley was the last person standing. They would know that she's now dropped out, but they wouldn't be able to list off all the other people who had dropped out up until that point. In terms of assessing persuasiveness, this is important because it's slightly different to how you may have done, if you've judged high school debates, or if you were a high school debater and you're coming into uni, the way that we judge is a little bit different. And the main difference, honestly, is that there's less of a focus on manner. So that is, it's less important how you speak, and it's much more important what you say. And that's for a bunch of reasons, but that's the important takeaway. So the most important thing to think about as a judge is, has a team proven a claim? And obviously, there are some instances where you don't need to prove a claim. Like, for example, if you said that we're currently experiencing warm weather in Sydney, that doesn't need to be proven because that's clearly true. However, if you were saying that, I don't know, sorry, I'm not meant to swear at this presentation, but if you were saying that, for example, school uniforms should be banned because kids dislike wearing school uniforms, you need to prove why kids dislike school uniforms. You can't just say that they dislike them. So what that means is that you can't assert things, and as a judge, you should credit analysis that has been proven rather than just asserted. So you need to explain why something is likely to happen. You need to explain why something is true, and you always need to explain why it's important. And as a judge, a good way to kind of see, was that analysis proven? Is it how detailed it was, if it was precise, and if it's plausible? So for example, sometimes teams are trying to prove really implausible things, and you can buy them sometimes, but they need to have a pretty big kind of level of analysis to prove those types of claims. So basically, the only time you should take into account style and manner is when it impacts the speaker's comprehensibility. So for example, the only time you should take into account if they were slow or fast or loud or soft is if you physically couldn't hear their speech or you physically couldn't understand their speech. If it's just you have a preference for speakers that speak slower, you can't give them higher speaks just because that's your own preference. So it actually has to interfere with your understanding of the debate. And that's really important because otherwise speakers end up getting penalized unfairly. So for example, people who have a lower voice often end up getting penalized, or people that have an accent end up getting penalized if English is not their first language. And that's obviously incredibly unfair. So the way we account for that is not taking style and manner into consideration. So the next thing to think about as a judge is contradictory pieces of analysis. So if, for example, the affirmative says something in first speaker and then contradicts themselves in second speaker, what you should do is you should assume that the first statement they made is the one that they meant to make. You can't take both of them to be true because that's not the case. So either you take one or they're both weakened. I think a good rule of thumb is to assume the first piece is correct. Often the other team will point it out for you, so you don't need to worry about that too much. Rebuttal is obviously a really important part of debating, and it's a really important part of judging because often a team that gives the best rebuttal can be the team that ends up winning the debate. However, there are a few things to note as a judge about rebuttal when you're assessing it. So firstly, rebuttal doesn't discount an argument. So just because something has been responded to, that doesn't mean that that argument ceases to exist. So if a team has just spent a lot of time proving why school uniforms are restricting a freedom of expression, and negative then says, oh, well, but you can express yourself in other ways. That's true, but that doesn't mean that what affirmative said isn't true. It just potentially lowers it down a little bit. So just because there are weaknesses in something, it doesn't take the argument out of the factor. And when you're giving the oral adjudication, you should always note all of the things that have been said, even if they've been responded to. Secondly, just because an argument isn't responded to, it doesn't make it automatically good. Because, for example, a lot of teams will often prioritize what arguments they respond to, and the top priority things to respond to should be the best things, right? Because they're the things that are the most likely to make you lose the debate. So like if the other team says good stuff, you want to respond to that stuff, so you have a high chance of winning. So if a team hasn't responded to something, that often can be a sign that that thing is just not that good, and you should kind of use your intuition to check that. The other thing is, use your ears. So a lot of the time speakers won't say like, and now I'm going to do some rebuts. They'll just move on to like doing responsive. So you need to be aware that they're moving on to that. And you can also like, arguments themselves can count as rebuttal. Like nothing has to be framed as rebuttal for it to work as rebuttal. Just like listen to the debate and follow it, and you'll be able to tell when things respond. This is a useful guideline for weighing frameworks. So this is essentially when teams are weighing their arguments, and when you're judging the debate, it's like, okay, well, for example, if there are two clashes in the debate, which clash is more important? So, the first thing to note is that teams might disagree on what the most important thing in the debate is. And that means that the judge shouldn't then just enter the debate and be like, okay, well, I think X is more important, so that's what we're going to judge the debate on. So for example, if the debate was like banning homeschooling and it was about the social impact versus the educational impact, if you as a judge are like, well, I think education is way more important, I'm going to prioritize that, that's not fair because the teams have disagreed about what's more important. So what you need to do is you basically need to ask yourself, firstly, and this is the criteria, did they agree? And we've said they haven't agreed, so that's unfortunate. If they didn't agree, did they implicitly agree? So was there time spent on one thing more? So were one of the issues more dominant, in which case that's a good metric to use. If that was also not the case, did one team manage to prove that one metric was important? So at least did the negative team prove that the educational part was more important? And if they did, then that's maybe a way to weigh the debate. And as a last resort, it's like, what would the OIV care about? So what would the ordinary intelligent voter care about? And that's a good thing to think about potentially. Teams might weigh for you and they might agree on what's important, and in which case, awesome. I think you'll find at the Easters level particularly, that often won't be the case. So you need to think about, okay, what does the OIV care about? What did they spend the most time talking about? Did they say that anything was important in a way that was persuasive? And remembering that the best arguments fit 3 criteria. They are plausible, they are important, and they have a high chance of coming to fruition, so they are likely. Okay, so speaker scores. This is the guideline of how to give them out. The most important thing to note if you're a new judge coming in is that there are no low point wins. So basically what that means is that the team that has the higher number of speaker points must be given the win. And what that means is that you should do the ballot, so fill out the speaker points after you've already decided a result, so that you then know. So it's like, okay, this debate was really close, but affirmative wins, then fill in the ballot and make the margin close. So a good rule of thumb is a margin of 1 to 2 is really close. 3 is close but clear. So the debate was still good, like both sides contributed a lot of stuff, but you know, it was clear by a point who was going to win. A margin of more than 5 this is very clear. Most average people would come in and clearly see that X team won. That's the speaker scale, the top bit cut off, but that's a 79 to 80 range. This is a really good thing to have if you're judging Easters. I recommend saving the speaker score. It'll be in the manual that gets sent out, but save that to your computer so you have it to reference. The average speaker score at Easters is a 75. This is a ballot from Easters last year. This was a debate with a negative one, and it was a close but clear debate, as evidenced by the 3-point margin. But yeah, the most important thing is you always have to give the team with the total number of speaker points that are higher the win. So for example, like the first affirmative can outspeak the first negative and negative still wins. It's just the total at the bottom. So the number at the bottom needs to be higher for the team that's winning. Speaker scores are obviously very subjective, but as a judge, just think like, I think it's helpful to compare speeches to speeches you've heard in the past. If you're not sure what speaker score to give, the average speech is a 75 at a tournament like Easters. It's very rare that you would see an 80. That is an extremely good speech. Like, you know, as you can see in this ballot, the third negative speech was really good, and I gave her a 78, not an 80 or a 79. Similarly, giving out a 70 is extremely punitive, and the only time I think that you would give out a 70 is if the speaker has literally got up, said virtually nothing, and sat back down within 10 seconds. If they make even close to an argument, I would be giving them a 71 or above. A 70 is really the bottom of the barrel, in my opinion. These are a few common pitfalls I've heard when people have been judging for the first time and kind of weren't sure on how they should judge the debate. So for example, saying affirmative 1 because they work for the government, so they must know what they're talking about. This is an example of, that's great that affirmative works for the government, but that does not mean that they know what they're talking about. But even if it does, that shouldn't factor into your decision. The average reasonable voter would not know that one team works for the government, so that shouldn't influence your decision. Similarly, neg 1 because AF didn't have a principal. AF may not have needed a principal, like that's not a metric at all. The metric could be that neg 1 because their principal was great, but it shouldn't be that they won because AF didn't have a principal. You absolutely don't need a principal. In fact, I think you need one less than you need one. Sorry, you don't need one more than you do need one. Finally, saying AF won because their team had a pro. This is particularly an issue at the Easters level. Just because a team has a pro, it doesn't mean that they always win debates. It is very plausible and likely, it happens all the time, that a team of novices beats a team that has a pro in it. Having a pro is just a bonus, but it shouldn't impact your decision at all. I'm a pro and there are many debates I've lost to novices. So that is absolutely a thing that happens all the time. So how to be a good panelist? If you're watching this seminar, it probably means you are like starting judging, which means you'll probably start as a panel and not as a chair. So the way to be a good panelist is, firstly, always express your opinions. Even if they're different to the chair, don't just automatically bow down to the chair and agree with everything they say. Like, you want to have a discussion, you want to explain your thoughts. Always ask questions if you're confused. Like, if you don't understand something the chair's said, then you should ask for clarification, because it may be that the debaters will also not understand what the chair's going to say in the OA. So it's useful to have that clarified. Don't suck up to the chair. So don't just, like, as I said earlier, agree with everything they say. Honestly, I think that's worse than when panelists have a different opinion, because at least they have an opinion. Don't exclude the trainee. So often the trainee is less experienced at debating. They might not have seen many debates before, but they also want to learn. So don't exclude them from the conversation. And finally, just like, don't be a prick. So don't think, oh, I'm too good to be a panelist or whatever. Like, the way that allocations are done is different with every AdJCore, which means that sometimes being a panel is actually better than being a chair. In many instances, your allocations are very different each round. So you try not to read into the allocations, I think is really important as a judge. I guess there's an extra thing to add, but I obviously know from judging quite a lot of majors that getting your allocations is very stressful, and it's like you want to read into them and read to see if you can figure out what your judge score is like. Don't do that. It just drives you insane. It's so hard to know. Every AdJCore has different preferences and you don't know what clashes are in the mix and all of that. So just like, don't read into it. If you're a panel, you're a panel. Do a good job as a panel. If you're a chair, if you're a trainee, whatever it is, and fulfill that role. A few pieces of lingo that you might hear at Easters that you might want to be aware of. The first is getting promoted. What that means is that you've previously were a trainee and then you're a panel, or you were previously a panel and then you were a chair. So getting promoted means you've worked your way up to the slot above you. Roll the chair, we've explained, is when two panelists disagree with the chair and then one of them ends up giving the OA. OIV we've talked about, ordinary intelligent voter. Entering the debate, we've also talked about a bit, which is where the judge kind of reads into the debate with their own personal biases, or they overcredit arguments to a team that they like, or they kind of make the end of an argument for a team even when the team didn't make them. That's entering the debate, and that's something you should avoid doing absolutely at all costs. Finally, rep calling. Rep calling is where you think a judge gives a debate to the team that has, for example, a pro in it, or has like well-known or reppy debaters in it, and they automatically get the win, even if it's not deserved. Rep calling is something we want to avoid. It's why team codes are anonymized. At least I think they're anonymized, because otherwise, actually, maybe they're not. Sorry, I actually don't know if they're anonymized at Easters or not. But rep calling is bad, and you should avoid doing it. You should never do it, because the debate is the debate, and it's not about previous debates. It's about the one that you're currently in. Cool. There are not going to be any questions because this is on Zoom. Hope that was helpful. If you've lasted the whole seminar, then bloody good job. Yeah, that's it from me. I hope everyone has an awesome time at Easters, and I will see you there.